All right, good afternoon. In continuing with my trend, I actually forgot to hit the record button when I was doing this live. Although since very few people showed up live to begin with, this is probably fine that I do a pre-recorded one anyway. So here is round two of my attempt at the review for this week for contemporary world issues, dealing with the issue of global gun violence. In particular, what I'm going to be reviewing today is one, pretty short because it was just a shorter week of stuff, but also is going to focus primarily on one, the lessons that we can learn from global mass shootings, what sort of conclusions we can draw about trends in mass shootings abroad versus here. Again, helping to hopefully finish building that sort of background for what exactly the U.S. needs to change, if anything, when it comes to trying to solve our gun violence issues. We're going to talk about what we can learn from global gun laws, so like what seems to work for them, what doesn't necessarily seem to work. And then we'll start to do some of that comparing and contrasting of the U.S. and the world. And I did put a section for questions, but there weren't any this week, so I'm not going to answer any. You just have to deal with me talking. So, whatever that means to you. All right, here we go. So, first and foremost, some of the takeaways from global mass shootings, where they're similar, where they're different. So, for the world abroad, including places like France, Britain, Germany, but only focusing on R3 because they're a nice sample size of Australia, New Zealand, and France. Some of the things that we can see in patterns of their perpetrators are, first and foremost, none of the perpetrators are motivated by mental instability. And what I mean by that is they all made a choice, and they decided to commit these acts of violence, not because there was something imbalanced in their brain that caused them to do so, but because they were rational human beings, or, well, not necessarily rational, but they were people without any sort of outside influences that made these decisions of their own accord. For example, in New Zealand, the perpetrator was an alt-right extremist. He was a guy who really hated people of Islam, practitioners of Islam, and so he decided to take that out on the mosques. And he was making his own extreme choice. However, there was no mental instability behind it. He was just a radical individual. For Australia, the individual was motivated by financial issues. You could see a continuous problem in his history where he's trying to purchase land in the Port Arthur area, and it had been denied repeatedly. And then also the fact that he was potentially motivated by the attention that other mass shooters had gotten in the news leading up to this event. However, there was no mental instability attached to it. He was interviewed by psychologists after he was captured because he was taken alive after this event, and they concluded that there were no extreme signs of mental instability beyond the fact that at some points he had seemed depressed. Nothing like we talked about in the United States, where the San Ysidro McDonald's shooter said that like voices were telling him to do it, or the Texas tower shooter had a very clear mass in his brain that caused him to have violent tendencies. And then in France, it was a terrorist attack. It was just straight up, these are, again, extremists that made their choice. However, there was no mental instability attached to it, no mental illness that we are aware of. So, big differences in motives. That's very key when thinking about how we handle gun laws. Is, if we had a similar situation to them, then perhaps we need to be paying more attention to what kind of belief systems people have when they get access to firearms, rather than if they are mentally healthy or not. But that's not the case necessarily. From there, too, it's important to note that at least overseas, their shooters are predominantly not native to the country where it takes place, whereas here in the United States, they are. So like France, the terrorists predominantly from Belgium. They've been radicalized by Islamic State members from Iraq. And the Christchurch shooter was from Australia. So he actually moved from Australia to New Zealand to commit that act of violence. So that's perpetrators. So pretty different from ours. On the weapon side, this is where it's a lot more similar in that all three of the attacks, handguns are present. Everybody had handguns. All three also involved semi-automatic military-style weapons. Two of them, Australia and New Zealand, involved the AR-15, which is the same style of weapon that was used in many of the larger-scale attacks in the United States. And then for the French one, they used the Zastava M70 assault rifles, which were also semi-automatic weapons, just not the traditional AR-15. And when I say large-scale attacks, what I mean by that is that these are comparable in loss of life to the more extreme ones that we talked about in the United States. So like for Australia's shooting, 35 people died, and then there's also wounded, but we're going to focus on the dead. For New Zealand, they had 51 die, and for France, they had 137. In comparison, for the United States, in the Las Vegas shooting, 54 people died. In the Orlando nightclub shooting, 50 people died. So these numbers are relatively similar. So drawing comparisons between weapons and the shooters is worthwhile because they had similarly destructive shooting sprees. So moving from there, time to look at gun laws. So some similar, some different when it comes to mass shootings. What about gun laws? Well, in gun laws, they tend to be, again, sort of similar, sort of different. For the most part, much like us, semi-automatic weapons are consistently viewed as not dangerous. They're only moderately restricted, but they're not outright prohibited. Whether it's the United States, Australia, New Zealand, France, and any of our states, everyone pretty consistently is like, yep, that is okay for you to have semi-automatic weapons. They sometimes have restrictions on like what kind of modifications you can have or why you can have it or how many you can have, but you're always allowed to acquire them. In foreign situations, however, there was a very important difference that I wanted to emphasize, which is they have something called the genuine reason clause, which is that New Zealand, Australia, and France all require people trying to get firearm license to provide what they consider to be a good reason to own a firearm, whether it is to go hunting, self-defense, to competitive shoot. It has to be something that the organizations that hand out the licenses say, yeah, that's fine. We think that that is a good reason for you to have one. But what we conclude from these mass shootings is that when it comes to mass shootings, so mass acts of violence, not like day-to-day, like one shooting, but when you have lots of people being killed, the genuine reason clauses do not prevent them or prevent any sort of extreme occurrences because all of these individuals acquired their guns legally. The New Zealand shooter purchased his online. The Australia shooter also purchased his online. The French shooters purchased theirs in Belgium, and all of them had licenses to get those firearms. They had provided genuine reasons and then simply ignored that genuine reason and committed the crime. So that didn't do a whole lot to prevent the mass shooting. Also, what's worth noting is that attempts to restrict handguns do not really correlate to a reduction in these mass shooting violence either. Both Australia and France have very heavy restrictions, specifically on barrel length and caliber size for handguns, because they are concerned about people concealing them and trying to commit acts of violence with them. And clearly that did not do a whole lot and also doesn't necessarily acknowledge the problem, since we also agreed or observed that semi-automatic military style weapons are also very common in these shootings, not just handguns. And again, these people who committed them had handguns. So like clearly they met all the requirements by these areas to get access to a handgun or to get access to firearms. And so these kind of unique rules don't do a whole lot for preventing acts of mass violence. And so this leads to kind of some important conclusions we can draw before we move into next week and start to try to finalize our look at mass shootings in general. So when we compare mass shootings, there's a couple key takeaways between the United States and foreign countries. Most importantly is that whether it's the US or foreign countries, the most lethal shootings involve semi-automatic weaponry, whether it is the AR-15, which is the most common one, or like the Zastava M70 or other semi-automatic weapons. When you have 50 plus people dying, there's almost always a semi-automatic weapon involved. On top of that, an important difference is that non-American shootings are not associated with mental health issues. So that is a decidedly unique thing to us, that most of our mass shootings take place because of mental health issues. That is not seen overseas. From there, we also have mass shooting weapons being traditionally legally obtained. So preventing the people that commit acts of mass violence currently is not happening. Like we are not doing, countries are not using laws that effectively restrict them, whether it is because they're not vetting them enough or it's just not possible to restrict them or prevent them from getting firearms because there's no way of identifying that. That's up for you to decide, but what you can say for certain is that currently the laws do not prevent the people who would commit acts of mass violence from getting their firearms, because it continues to happen both here and overseas. From there, it's also important to note that the loss of life is comparable. So like, we do not have this unique situation where more people die in the United States. We have about as many people die as the other countries overseas do in mass shootings, sometimes more, sometimes less. It just kind of depends on the situation, but nothing directly tied to the United States. And then lastly, what's important to note too is that foreign shooters survive the events. So they tend to arrest their shooters. In the case of New Zealand and Australia, both of the shooters were arrested and are now went through the trial process and are now serving prison time for their acts. Whereas in the United States, it's extremely uncommon. We predominantly either have the shooters be executed by police, or what is even more common is the shooters themselves take their own lives and end their spree that way. So that's on the shooting end. So similar in loss of life and in the weapons used, but the causes are very different. When we compare laws now, we also see some kind of similarities and differences in that foreign countries tend to have more restrictions on what kinds of firearms are allowed. So whether it is handguns, shotguns, in general, foreign countries will let you have fewer things available to you. It's harder to acquire certain firearms, with the exception of semi-automatic weapons. But even handguns, like, there's more restrictions there. Shotguns, they have barrel length restrictions that are harsher, things like that, than here in the United States. Foreign countries also have a tradition of adjusting these laws after mass shootings, while we do not. After the Christchurch mosque shooting, New Zealand banned all semi-automatic rifles. After the Port Arthur massacre, Australia cracked down on their vetting process. They went into a lot more detailed steps about what you have to go, hoops you have to jump through to get a firearm. Whereas in the United States, we, for the most part, have not changed laws in any way, shape, or form. And then lastly, all countries have very loose buying and selling laws, in that there's not very long waiting periods. And more importantly, the steps that you have to go through to purchase a firearm from a private seller. So this is like just a Joe Schmo who got a license to sell guns. To buy from him, very few countries have any sort of steps. Like, you basically just have to show your license and then that's it. You can get it. There's no additional steps, with the exception of New Zealand, where it has to be approved by the police. But France, Australia, United States, all of them just kind of let you do it on your own and don't really check up on it too much. So hopefully, again, this is starting to help you solidify what exactly is similar, what is different, where seem to be our personal problem areas, and what seem to be some potential rules that do or do not help prevent violence. This is important to keep in mind too, because next week we're going to be pretty much finishing up this unit. Now, this schedule is not quite up to date because Monday we will actually have no assignment due to the fact that it is a digital prep day for teachers. So you'll just kind of bump everything down on this schedule one. So on Tuesday, we will be going over global gun violence statistics, so the day-to-day gun violence, to give you a feel for that component and how that compares to the United States as opposed to these mass shootings, these ultimately rarer events. Tuesday, we'll make final comparisons between the United States and foreign countries, so like, where are those similarities and differences? And then on, sorry, that would be Wednesday that we're doing the final comparisons. And then on Thursday, you'll start to work on a gun law essay and what your final take is on these gun laws. Do we in the United States need to make reforms or not? And then Friday, you'll have continued work time. And then I'll also do our Friday review, in which I'll kind of talk about what I am looking for in those essays, what the do's and don'ts, to make sure that you receive good grades on those essays. So that's it for this week. It was a shorter video, in part because it's a shorter week. If you have any questions, as usual, feel free to email me. But otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day. As I struggle to stop my video. There it is. All right, goodbye.